thank you all for joining this afternoon. My name is Katie Matthew. I'm the Director of Research and Evaluation for the State Charter Schools Commission of Georgia, and I will be kicking off the presentation today regarding some updates to the Comprehensive Performance Framework for future years. We also have Morgan Feltz on our team who will present some of the financial updates, and then Tiffany Leach who will round us out with some organizational updates. We will stop at the end of each section to allow some time for questions, so you should see the question box there that you're able to type some questions into, and we will be looking at that periodically to address those questions. Additionally, I do want to let you know that the updates, these slides and updated CPF documents are currently posted on our website. There's a link at the end of this presentation. Also, if you just go to our website, the school performance page, you should be able to see that easily. Once this webinar is complete, we will also post the recording on our website so that anyone who was not in attendance today can still access the recording. And finally, we'll also cover this at the end of the presentation as well, but on our website is a form for you to submit public feedback or comment regarding any of these proposed updates. That form will be open through the end of this month, so feel free to share any thoughts that you have regarding these proposed updates via that form. Our hope is to take any feedback or comments and concerns that we hear from you all, update any of the recommendations that we have accordingly, and then propose for adoption the final updates at the July SCSC board meeting. Of course, that timeline is still tentative, but that is the general timeline that we plan to follow. So without further delay, I will go ahead and jump right into our proposed updates. So of course, before we ever start talking about the Comprehensive Performance Framework, we always want to remind everyone how the framework is derived, and it is derived to help fulfill our vision and our mission. And since I will start off by talking about the academic section of the framework, as you all know, that directly relates back to our mission of providing students with a better educational opportunity than they would otherwise receive in the traditional district schools to which they're zoned to attend. So quick overview for any of those attendees who are new to learning about the Comprehensive Performance Framework, or the CPF. It was adopted in 2016 to set forth clear, quantifiable, rigorous, and attainable goals for state charter schools. 3 areas of the framework are covered, including academic achievement, financial management, and operational compliance. And each one of these sections has a fundamental question that it seeks to answer. And as I noted, the academic section relates directly back to our mission. And we'll cover each section so that you can see how the measures cover each one of these fundamental questions. Academics. So as you all know, we just wrapped up the 2022-2023 school year. There were no assessments or accountability waivers for this current school year that just ended. As I know many of you are aware, this was the first year since the COVID pandemic, since the 2019-2020 school year, in which no assessment or accountability waivers were granted. However, the Georgia Department of Ed did submit an addendum to the U.S. Department of Ed requesting some modifications to the statewide accountability tool, or the CCRPI. Specifically, what they requested was to have no summative ratings for districts and schools. So they still are proposing to calculate indicator and component scores on that 100 scale score, but then not roll that up into an overall school score. And this change is meant to apply for this current school year that just was completed and also all future years. So it wasn't a one-time waiver request due to COVID. It was just a request to change the model moving forward. More updates on that request can be found on the Georgia Department of Ed Accountability website, which is linked here on this slide. We have yet to hear back from the U.S. Department of Ed on this request. So this request is still pending. There are some other changes to the CCRPI in this request as well, if you want to take a look at the other details of that are on the website. However, the no summative rating, the no CCRPI grade band score, the no CCRPI single score, those are the big changes that would impact the SCSE academic section of the CPF. So just as review, these are the components of the CCRPI, so content mastery, progress, closing gaps, readiness, and graduation rate. So again, what Godot is proposing is that they would still calculate each one of these components, each one of these things that are represented in the color boxes. They just wouldn't roll it all up into a comprehensive CCRPI score. So we'd still have content mastery, we'd still have progress, we'd still have those pieces that we use within the framework. They're just not getting rolled up to the overall score. So this is what our section of our academic measures would look like if the U.S. Department of Ed approves that request. Like I said, we'd still have CCRPI content mastery, we'd still have CCRPI progress, and value added is not impacted by this update either. However, we would no longer have CCRPI grade band score, CCRPI single score, or beating the odds, because beating the odds is calculated based off of CCRPI single score. So CCRPI single score is no longer being calculated. Is highly likely that beating the odds, which is calculated in collaboration between the Georgia Department of Ed and the Governor's Office of Student Achievement, that they would no longer be able to calculate that score. Of course, we would still have conversations with GOSA and see if they would be willing to create or calculate a beating the odds score for state charter schools moving forward, but it wouldn't, it's not necessarily guaranteed that it would be calculated. We have reached out to GOSA and asked them what their plans are for beating the odds if the amendment gets approved, and they don't have a solid response yet. They're just, they're in a holding pattern until the amendment either gets approved or denied. So we're kind of still in limbo regarding that request. So if this goes through, the SCSE is recommending to calculate CCRPI grade band score ourselves. So we would use the public data files that get posted on the CCRPI website, and we would follow the methodology as described in the CCRPI calculation guides. And so you can see that box there, that picture that gives the percentages by grade band for each component. We would calculate single score for each grade band using those weights for each component. And this is pulled directly from the CCRPI calculation guides. And there's a couple reasons why we want to do that, right? If we, generating the CCRPI grade band score allows SCSE schools to demonstrate performance across all components in the CCRPI. If we don't have CCRPI grade band score and we just use content mastery and progress, then we would be leaving out performance for schools where they show progress on closing gaps, readiness, and graduation rate. And we still want to account for those for our schools. So that's why we propose just calculating it ourselves. And it would function the same way as it has in previous years. A school would be considered meeting standards if it has a higher CCRPI grade band score than its comparison zone in all grade bands served, or on a whole school score calculation. And I'll talk more about what a whole school score calculation is on later slides. But for operational schools, you guys have seen that before. It's what we've called like a grade band weighted enrollment calculation, where we're weighting the school score based off of your enrollment across grade bands. So essentially, this would operate and function the same way it has in the past. It's just that instead of coming from the Georgia Department of Ed, it would come from us using Georgia Department of Ed public data files. The next recommendation that we have for moving forward is that we will no longer calculate comparison scores based off of the attendance zone in the charter contract, also called the simple average comparison score. So for any schools that were an SESC school prior to the 2018-2019 school year, you may remember this simple average comparison score. We just looked at whatever you had designated as your attendance zone in your charter contract, and we compared your school score to the simple average of whatever designation score that was. So if you had a statewide attendance zone, you were compared to the statewide score. If you had a defined attendance zone of one district, you were compared to that district score. If you had a defined attendance zone of multiple districts, you were compared to the simple average of those districts. Well, starting in 2018, 2019, the Georgia Department of Ed collected student address data and student record. And what that allowed us to do is to get the student addresses for every single student in state charter schools. From there, we were able to do some geocoding and map students back to the school that they were actually zoned to attend based off of their address reported in student record. And then we can roll those up and get proportions of students at your school to see what proportion of them would go back to which local schools, and we're able to calculate a comparison score that way. So it's very much more precise and accurate than using just whatever's based in the attendance zone. So as you can see here on this slide, we say that using the enrollment-based comparisons, we increase the precision and accuracy of the comparison as the comparisons are based on actual enrollment residency numbers for the given year. It also reduces any incentive to game the accountability system or the attendance zone system, and you can you'll see what I mean by that on the next slide. And also, one thing to call out here is that even though we have multiple schools who have varying attendance zones, that have statewide attendance zones or have defined attendance zones that serve multiple counties, what we see is that a majority of schools are serving usually one specific location. So based on 2022 enrollment, 26 out of 37, so 70% of state charter schools enrolled 75% or more of their students from one district. So as you can see, a majority of schools are enrolling from just one district, and only 6 of those 26 had a defined attendance zone of one district. So again, you guys out there, you have attendance zones that serve all across the state, and that's great. We are excited that you're able to offer an opportunity to students in multiple districts. However, when it comes down to comparing academic performance for accountability, we are only going to compare you to those schools and those districts from which those students were actually enrolled to attend. So for instance, here is an example of why we no longer want to use the simple average comparison. And so this is an example school. It has a defined attendance zone of 3 districts. And that top row there says enrollment. That's the percent of students it enrolls from each of those 3 districts that is in the attendance zone. And then below that is the corresponding grade band score for those districts. So you can see the District 3 has the lowest CCRPI score, so that really brings down that comparison average, but this school only enrolls 2% of their students from that district. So you can see on that gray row in the table there, that comparison score is a 67 because we're weighting each of those comparison districts equally. However, with the weighted comparison average, the comparison score is actually higher because we're weighting each of those scores based off of the percent of students they enroll from each district. So that's actually a more precise and accurate comparison. And as you all know, the weighted average comparison, we have done this every year. So this is not new. We did this for your 2022 scores, for your 2021 scores, for your 19 scores. Of course, we didn't have 20 scores. So this is not a new calculation. We've been running these weighted comparison averages for the last few years. So here we are. I'm not going to read this to you all, but I included it just so if you reference these slides again in the future, you can know you can see all the examples for how the comparison scores will be calculated. So we'll have the district comparison zone score and the school comparison zone score. Again, as I noted, these are not new. This is how your school has been compared to performance in the most recent years of academic performance that we've shared with you. So on the most recent CPF scores that you just received, these were the scores that your school was compared to. So again, this is not new. All we're saying is that we will no longer, moving forward, we will no longer calculate that simple average comparison. We will solely rely on this district comparison score and the school comparison score that are based on where your students were actually enrolled to attend. So, academic updates to the CPF. Those two that I just talked about, those two updates, they would go into effect immediately for the next CPF report that would come out. So those would go into effect for the 2022-2023 CPF report. And that is because if this amendment gets approved by the U.S. Department of Ed, it would go into effect immediately by the Georgia Department of Ed. So they would not be calculating grade band scores for your 2022-2023 school year. And so we don't want to go a year without having those scores for you guys. So we would just go ahead and calculate it. And then the streamlining the comparison scores, that has already been in effect for the last 3 years. So we're just clarifying that that will continue to be the way that schools are compared. We are also proposing to you today to make some changes to the academic section of the CPF for the 2023-2024 school year. So those would, if passed in July, those would go into effect immediately, but you wouldn't see them play out until the relative school year, so until the 2023-2024 CPF. So we're proposing a few things here, and we'll run through each of those. The first is adding a exceeds standards category. So one of the issues we've had when it comes to transparency and clarity when communicating with stakeholders is what it means to be meeting standards. And so these next few recommendations that I'm going to share with you all are really focused on creating greater transparency and clarity for stakeholders, for families, for schools, for legislators, for anybody who is looking at state charter school performance to better understand how those state charter schools are performing. So how do we distinguish between schools that are meeting standards and those that are far exceeding? Well, in 2021-2022, 84% of state charter schools outperformed from the schools from which they enroll students. The point difference between the school score and the comparison score for meeting standards ranged from 1 to 55. So a school that was 1 point higher than their comparison had the same designation as a school that was 55 points higher than their comparison score. And we want to set some sort of threshold to recognize those schools that are not only outperforming by 1 or 2 points, but have a greater range of outperforming their comparison schools. So we are proposing to add an exceeding standards designation to the academic section of the CPF. And this would apply to all CCRPI measures, content mastery, progress, and grade band. The rationale here is that it acknowledges those schools outperforming their comparison district above the minimum standards. So specifically, a school would be considered meeting academic standards if it scores 10 or more points higher than the comparison score. So a couple of reasons why we decided to go with an exceeding standards and the 10 points. So most independent charter board state authorizers, which is what the SCSC is, we are a state level independent charter board. When we looked at other independent state charter authorizers throughout the nation who have like a similar board makeup as we do, 11 of those 15 include an exceeds designation in their performance framework. So this is not new. We're not the only ones to do this. A lot of boards, a lot of charter authorizing boards include an exceed standards. So we're kind of following suit in that place. A 10-point threshold is used by other well-regarded authorizers with a geographic comparison measure. That CSC in some ways is unique, and that our academic section relies solely on comparisons and whether you're outperforming, those schools the students would otherwise go to. When we look at other authorizers who also compare geographic comparisons, they used a 10-point difference from exceed standard. So we thought that that was a good place to start. Additionally, the alignment with a 10-point grading scale is commonly understood. So again, we're trying to make this more transparent for everyone. So if you think about a A through F grading scale, if you are located in a B district or you're serving schools that average out to having a B score, well, to be exceeding standards, you would essentially need to have an A. So just relying back to that commonly held grading scale of a 10-point difference. So if you're outperforming by a whole grade letter, then that would mean that you would be considered exceeding standards. And then finally, of course, we ran some data to look at the variation of the differences. So the average variation of difference between the school score and the comparison score across measures was about 10 points. So we used CCRPI data to look at this, and what we did was just look at the difference between the school score and the comparison score across all schools and measures. And then when we averaged out those differences, the average came to about 10 points across each of the measures. So we said, okay, so that's what an average school would perform at 10 points or below. So to be non-average, to exceed, we need you to be higher than 10 points. So that's the rationale behind why we wanted to make the exceeding standards a 10-point threshold. The next proposed update that I have to share with you all is adjusting the approaches standards language. So you can see there how the current language reads, and then I have crossed out what would no longer apply. So approaches standards from here on out would be simply that the charter school earned a score that is the same as the comparison score. No longer the difference between performance across grade bands. Additionally, we'd be updating approaches, the same as or the as well as, to be defined as no more than 2 points below the comparison zone. Currently, the same as, in quotes, definition is no more than 2% below the school score. And again, for the general public, that is just not very transparent. It's not very clear. You can't easily look at the school score and the comparison score and right off the bat know whether that is 2% below that comparison score or not. But you can easily identify whether it's 2 points below. And that's actually a greater threshold for approaches standards. Usually the comparisons, the percent difference between, to make it be a 2% difference is under 2 points, 1 point, 1.5 point, 1 point in some decimals. So this is actually growing the approaches standards bubble a little bit by making it a full 2 points. Okay, so just to hint at again why the wording of the approaches standards is currently confusing and not as transparent as it could be for stakeholders. So currently schools that serve across grade bands can have varying performance levels, but all have the same designation of approaches standards. And what you see here is just an example of 4 different combinations of a school that would serve across K-8, 4 different performance combinations, all which would still receive the same designation of approaches standards. So you could have a school that, for instance, in block number 2 that performs the same as the comparison schools across both districts. Maybe they're just, they're just 1 point below there. They're really in that same spot. And then the difference of, say, a school that is in box number 4, where it performs below in one grade band and performs the same as in the middle grade band. If I was a parent and I was looking at schools and I was thinking, oh, this school's approaching standards, that might be, that might be something that I'm interested in for my child. Well, if I had a better breakdown and realized, well, they're actually performing below in elementary school when I have a 3rd grader, maybe maybe that isn't actually the school that I want to choose for my student. So we want to just clarify this language so that parents, families, stakeholders are more clear on what approaches standards mean. And it means that you are right on par with the comparisons across all of the grade bands that you serve. So again, here's how it would read. Approaches standards the state charter school performed as well as no more than 2 points below the comparison zone. So each grade band will receive its own designation. To account where a school has different designations in each grade band, a whole school score will be generated by weighting the grade band scores proportionally based on the charter school's enrollment in each grade band and weighting and summing the total. Again, this is not a new calculation. We have done this calculation for the past several years. We've called it a grade band weighted enrollment score, where we're creating a whole school score weighting across those grade bands. So for operational schools, this should not look new to you. You've seen this in past years if you serve across grade bands. If you only serve one grade band, then it's not necessary. But if you've served across multiple grade bands, we've calculated this for you in the past. A school that serves across grade bands can still be designated approaches standards if it performs as well as the comparison score in all relevant grade bands or on its whole school score. So just an example here of what that looks like when you're calculating the data and the comparison scores. So for this school, all of this data would be displayed as part of the school's academic report and CPF score, so that you can see the performance across each grade band and then the whole school score. So you see the SCSE score for each component in each grade band, and then you see the district weighted score and the school weighted comparison score. As I mentioned before, those are the two that we calculated last year and will continue to calculate moving forward. And you can see here that the school is outperforming in that middle grade band, but not across any measure in the elementary grade band. And then you look down at the enrollment, and they have 74% enrollment in the elementary grade, 26% enrollment in the middle grade. And so what you do is you just simply multiply that 74% across the elementary components, 26% across the middle components, and you sum those together to get the whole school scores and the whole school comparison scores. And unfortunately, in this case, this school would not meet standards because it has a majority of students in that elementary grade band. And so the weighting of the whole school score indicates that the school did not meet standards. Here's that whole school score calculation just laid out for you again. So you can see that's the calculation that I just spoke about. You see the percent enrollment in each grade band, and then they're just multiplied and summed across to get the comparison score. So in sum, how would these scores be used? The performance expectations, they remain basically the same to what you're familiar with. It's just a slight adjustment to the approaches standards again. So to meet standards, a state charter school can meet standards by outperforming in all grade bands or on a school-wide score. The approaches standards, a state charter school performs as well as the comparison in all grade bands or on the school-wide score, and does not meet a state charter school performs below the comparison in all grade bands served or on the school-wide score. So finally, this is the last slide of the academic section. So if you have any questions regarding the academic section, feel free to put that into the question box now, and I'll address it. So here we are. Here are the proposed metrics for the academic section of the CPF for the 2023-2024 school year. So you can see that schools may satisfy annual academic requirements by outperforming the comparison zone. Again, that's the schools or districts in that weighted calculation that we reviewed, from which its students are zoned to attend in all relevant grade bands on any one or combination of the following measures: CCRPI content mastery, CCRPI progress, CCRP grade band score, calculated by the SCSC. If that amendment gets approved, if the amendment does not get approved, Goodell will still be calculating that, so we'll just use that as regular, or the value add. So again, it's still applied the same way. You can outperform across all grade bands by any one or combination of the measures. So if you serve K-8 and you outperform in the elementary grade band in content mastery, but not in the middle grade band, but in the middle grade band you outperform on CCRPI progress, then you are meeting standards. That does not change. That's how it's applied in the past, and that will continue to apply in that same manner. Or by outperforming the comparison score on a school-wide calculated score that we just reviewed that calculation. Again, that calculation is not new. We've been doing that in the past. It just was never formally written into the CPF with the calculation and everything. It was kind of a one-off calculation we did. We want to make that more formal and calculate it every year for every school, and we would calculate that school-wide score for the content mastery, for progress, and the grade band score. And then the note there that I covered earlier, if BTO continues to be calculated, that will be included in the school-wide score as well. And as I mentioned, even if the Georgia Department of Ed's waiver does get approved, we do plan to have conversations with GOSA about calculating BTO for state charter schools moving forward, so we don't lose out on that measure. I will pause for just a moment to see if we have any questions. We have one that says, can you please share how many SCSC authorized schools met performance criteria on BTO loan in previous years? Yes, I can get that for you. Now, we haven't had BTO since the 2018-2019 school year, because we haven't had it at all since the COVID pandemic. But I don't have those numbers right in front of me right now. They are, if you look in the academic reports that are on our website, it tells you how every SCSC school performed across each measure each year. But I'm also happy to just provide that to you. If you can send me a quick email with that request, I'll be happy to reply via email. And I will continue to check the question box as we go along. So if you have any other academic questions that pop up while the other sections are presenting, then we'll have another chance at the end of the webinar to address all questions. And of course, if you have questions, you can always email me or any of my co-presenters following this presentation. And then of course, as I mentioned before, if you have feedback regarding the proposed updates, please input that on the feedback form that is on our website. With that said, I will keep us on time. Just so you all are aware, we blocked out 2 hours for this. I don't think it will take 2 hours, but that will definitely allow for us to have time to answer all the questions. So I will now pass it off to Morgan Feltz, who will be sharing with you all the financial proposed updates. And Morgan, you should be unmuted now. We are not able to hear you. If you are having trouble, Morgan, maybe try just calling in through the phone audio. What we will do as we try to work on getting Morgan audio so that she can speak to the slides. Oh wait, here we go. Maybe she's, okay. I think, can you speak now, Morgan?
Are you guys able to hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Great. Gotta love technology. Y'all bear with me while I rummage for some earphones and hopefully make this sound just a little bit better. All right. Everyone still able to hear me okay?
Yes.
Perfect. Sorry about that. So as Katie said, my name is Morgan Phelps. I am the Chief Operations Officer for the Commission, and I've also been handling the financial performance framework for the last couple of years. So I will talk you through some of the changes that we are proposing to that area of the framework. As we kind of dive in here, just to orient ourselves, I would characterize the changes to the finance portion of the framework to be about 90% reorg and about 10% new content. So just keep that in mind as we talk through this. So first off, here are our current financial metrics. So you guys should be really familiar with these. We looked at finances in both the near term and the long term, or what we call sustainability measures. So we have 5 short-term measures and 2 long-term or sustainability measures. And here is what we are looking at moving to. So first off, I'm going to start at the bottom there. We are adding a fiscal management and oversight indicator. And the vast majority of these things here are pulled directly from the operational section of the performance framework. So you guys are already measured on most of these right now. The enrollment variance piece is moving from the current financial, short-term financial to this indicator. And the new content for this one is the audit submission deadline. So just to say that one more time, the new indicator is going to be fiscal management and oversight. That pulls GAAP standards, federal financial requirements, LUA requirements, and school policies. All of those are pulled straight over from the operations section. Enrollment variance is moving from the current short-term financial section, and then the new content, brand new content here, is the audit submission timeline, which is only brand new in that it is now broken out as a separate measurement apart from other reporting deadlines. So you guys have always been measured on reporting deadlines in the operations section. You'll continue to be measured, but we are pulling out a separate audit submission timeline for this indicator. So to jump back up to the top, we are keeping the near-term and long-term measures here. They are the same measures as before. The only change, again, is that enrollment variance has been pulled down, and that is kind of aligning with national best practices. So, you know, what we've learned both nationally and looking at our own schools is that enrollment variance is a good predictor. It's a good estimate of how a school is managing their finances, but it's not necessarily indicative of the actual financial position of the school. So if you look now at that top part, the current ratio, unrestricted days cash, debt to income ratio, default, efficiency margin, and debt to asset ratio, all of that data will come 100% directly from a school's audit. And then at the bottom part, that information, those data sources will be a combination of, you know, school submissions as part of monitoring, school reporting to the SESC and Godot, and then school policies, reports, and that kind of thing. So I kind of already talked through this a good bit, but we are moving these fiscal management and oversight measures from the operations section to the financial section. The reason that we're doing this is that it allows for a fuller picture of the school's financial position. Whereas the top part, the part that we look at now is very quantitative in what it provides us. This kind of provides a qualitative look at performance that kind of goes alongside of that quantitative aspect of the near-term and long-term calculations. All the fiscal viability measures are grouped under indicator 1, again, come right from the audit, and then the fiscal management and oversight measure will be indicator 2, and again, that's derived from the commission and DOE data collections and monitoring activities. All right, so this is a little bit of the new content piece here. So unrestricted days cash. The recommendation here is that we increase the threshold from 45 days to 60 days. That means we're going to ask you to go from having 6 weeks cash on hand to 8 weeks or 2 months cash on hand. So the meet standard would become greater than 60 days. The approaches would be 15 to 60 days. The does not meet standard does not change from what it is currently. This aligns with national best practices. It emphasizes the importance of this measure for financial viability. If a school were to encounter an unexpected revenue shortage or unexpected expenditures, it is really this day's cash on hand that is going to be able to allow the school to kind of weather that situation. Overall, when we do kind of a national scan, Georgia is lagging behind on this measure currently. And so bumping it up to 60 days, again, aligning with best practices and putting us on closer footing with our national partners.
Morgan, I'm gonna jump in right here real quick because we have a question that's related. So I figure I'll just go ahead and ask it. And it says, does this apply to new schools as well?
Yes, it will apply to new schools. All right. Also, let me just add back to that question really briefly. Just keep in mind that what we're looking at when we're looking at the audit is where you end up at the very end of the year. That's what's going to be looking at your cash on hand. So it's not like we're looking at day one saying, expecting you to have 60 days cash on hand. This is looking at the close of the fiscal year. I'll also add that when we did an impact analysis for this, the vast majority of our schools, including new schools, are already hitting above that 60% threshold.
And I'll say one more note to that. And like the majority of the academic updates, these are proposed to go into effect if they get approved immediately. So for the 2023-2024 school year. So again, you wouldn't see these play out until those CPF results, although they go into effect for your financial planning purposes immediately.
That's correct. All right, so another piece, kind of a new content here is the enrollment variance. And remember, this one is moving from where it exists currently to that fiscal management and oversight indicator. So where I know y'all are likely to be mad at me about the cash on hand metric, I think you're overall going to be pretty happy with me about this one. So we are increasing the threshold from 2% to 3%. So you would meet the standards if your enrollment variance is less than 3%. It used to be 2%. So we are providing some additional flexibility there. The approaches standards will become 3 to 8%, and again, the does not meet will not change. This also aligns with national best practice. It incorporates the feedback that we've heard from a lot of you regarding the impact of external events on school enrollment, particularly from when we measure those projections in May to that October FTE count. So in looking at that and looking at how this measure is used nationally, and in looking at how it kind of corresponds with what it tells us about the school versus what the actual financial position of the school is, this is an area where we feel that we are in a place that we can provide some additional flexibility here. And again, that would move to be part of the financial oversight indicator. And then another new measure, again, not entirely new because you've certainly been measured on it before, but this is being broken out separately, is a measure for timely audit submission. If you submit the audit on time, which will be on or before November 1st, you will meet the standard. You get 30 days, so on or before December 1st, that would be considered approaches. And the does not meet standard is for any audit submitted after December 1st. As you can see, just from us talking through these indicators, the audit is incredibly important to us as we look to analyze the school's near-term and long-term position. When we get the audit in November, that's already, let me see, July, August, September, like 5 months into the new fiscal year. Anytime it's late, that just pushes us further into the new fiscal year, and we are not getting timely information about a school's financial position. And that prevents us as the authorizer from exercising proper oversight. So again, we did an impact analysis on this. If you tuned into our board meetings this year, you know that as a whole, it was a very small number of schools that submitted their audit late. So if you guys continue to do what you largely have been doing, these will be some of the easiest points you'll ever earn on the framework. All right, so kind of back to the reorganization piece. Another side of that is that we had to kind of reorg some of the points as well. So this is what it'll look like now. So we still have that near-term and sustainability piece indicator that previously totaled 100, it will still total 100. However, because we moved enrollment variance, we then had to kind of reapportion some of those points. So what you're seeing there is the proposed new point distribution. Those are where you see the heavier points. Again, those are based on areas that we want to emphasize based on national best practices and where we see schools needing to really focus their efforts. So that's kind of the rationale behind that distribution there. The new management and oversight indicator will also total up to 100 points. If you guys will recall, these measures in the operational section had much smaller point totals. So bringing them over here, they are going to carry higher points per measure. So again, you can see those things proposed there. Again, the items that have higher points are those items that we really want to emphasize and emphasize that schools should focus on as well. So obviously that adds up to 200 points. So how do we determine whether or not you're meeting financial standards as a whole? So you must earn a meet standard on both indicator 1 and indicator 2 to receive an overall meet financial standard. If you earn a does not meet on both indicator 1 and both indicator 2, you'll receive an overall does not meet financial standard. Any other combination of points or designations will result in an approaches financial standards designation. I think that is my last slide, but I think I have a question. So
yeah, and so there's a couple questions in here again about when these changes would go into effect. So just as a reminder, all of these changes that Morgan just went through, they would go into effect once they were approved. So for the upcoming school year. So what that means is the next CPF score that you get, it will not have these updates because it was for the school year. It was for FY23 that was already completed. So we hope to implement the changes in, have them adopted in July so you could go ahead and as you're operating through the 2023-24 school year, know how those will affect you throughout the year. So we're not going to retroactively apply them to the school year that already concluded. So they would, although they're going to effect immediately, you wouldn't see them come out until your 2023-2024 CPF because the 2022-23 CPF already ended, that school year already ended, and you wouldn't have had the opportunity to make any adjustments or monitor in the way against these standards. So they'd go into effect immediately, which means you wouldn't see them until your 2023-24 of CPF. Is there anything else you want to clarify for that, Morgan?
No, that's correct. And again, this is done so that schools do have the opportunity to reflect on any, process updates or anything like that that they need to make to accommodate the changes.
I have a couple other questions for you here. So one says, if you're going to add an indicator for audit submission, are there considerations for an SCSE approved auditor who submits the audit late at no fault to the school?
Yes, and there already are those considerations. So as of right now, and this has been the case since we've started the approved auditor program, a school always has the opportunity to appeal any part of their scoring for the CPF. We did the same thing for operations. So if there is an incident where you believe that the audit was submitted late through no fault of the school, I encourage you to appeal that score. We will request that you provide evidence to that effect, and we would review that. And if we determine that that was indeed the case, we would award those points.
We have another question here. What are the brackets, the partial points for the debt to income measurement for those larger schools with private activity bonds, et cetera? This is a sore spot. Morgan, I don't know if you have those in front of you, but I don't think we're proposing any changes there.
No, there are no changes, and there are, I think, which measure did you say?
The debt to income.
Yeah, so there are no partial points like what you might receive on an operation measure. It's just the meets, approaches, and does not meet.
Okay, maybe that partial points is the approaches. I think
okay.
Maybe they were considering. Yeah, I don't think we have that pulled up to look at right now. I don't think Morgan knows them off the top of her head. If you do, Morgan, feel free to share what those point breakdowns are, but we're not proposing any changes to that. So whatever is currently listed in the CPF, that would continue to be the points breakdown for the debt to income measurement.
Yeah, that's correct. And if you have additional questions as to, how your school will be impacted or something by those points, even if we're not proposing changes, you can always send me an email.
I'm going to have another one here that says, can you say more about the federal LUA and school policy requirements?
Sure. So again, those are items that have moved over from the operational section. You were previously measured on those. So there are no changes being proposed to those measures other than the location of them in the framework. But when we talk about compliance in that regard for, federal grants, when they do their cross-functional monitoring, any non-compliance, that type of thing. So that would be CSP, your title programs, IDEA. If you get any kind of finding or anything like that, that would be a deduction of points in that area. As far as the LUA manual goes, that is something that all districts are required to follow. Our monitoring team monitors for specific portions of that are particularly applicable to charter schools. And so that's what they're looking at. And then I think the other one was school policies. So again, that is looking at your policies, number one, to make sure that it aligns with any applicable law, whether it be the LUA manual or, your charter contract or whatever the case may be. So make sure that the policy in and of itself aligns with applicable law. And then they also monitor for whether or not you're actually following your own policy. And that's done through a combination of a desk audit as well as kind of the interview portion of the monitoring.
Thank you, Morgan. That's all the questions I currently see, but as I mentioned before, if more questions come to you as we finish out the presentation, feel free to input them and we will get to them a little bit later on. But from that, I am going to move to the next slide, which is the operations section, and I'm going to turn it over to Tiffany to review those changes for us. Hi, Tiffany, you're now unmuted.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to speak to Section 3 of the CPF, which is the operational performance updates. These updates are all a reorganization, and I'll be picking up sort of where finance left off because our first change begins in Indicator 2. I will say that Indicator 1, if you have your CPF out or if you later go back and reference in Section 3, schools are measured in 6 indicators. And so Indicator 1, which is educational program compliance, that indicator, there are no changes to it. And so that's why you see on the slide that our chart picks up in Indicator 2. Another note that I want to make is because it can sometimes get confusing to understand that the monitoring is just one data point that goes into your overall operational score on the CPF. So most schools are very familiar with, in the fall, we open the monitoring submission, and some schools may qualify for a visit as well with the health and safety visit, like the SCSC's monitoring cycle. That monitoring cycle, the results of the monitoring cycle is one data source that's considered in your operational CPF. So a lot of times when the CPF scores are released to schools, just before getting your CPF score, you also got monitoring results. And you may sometimes kind of put them together, but remember that the monitoring results are for the current school year. So operational schools, you got monitoring results in March from the corrective action plan and everything like that, because the initial results will come out in January. That was for the 22-23 school year. Those monitoring results that you received for this school year were not a data point in the CPF score that you got this year, because the CPF score that you received this year was for 21-22. So for 22-23, this school year, the monitoring results you receive will be in the next CPF score that you receive. So I just wanted to make sure that was clear and that it's one data point. So in the operations section, again, Indicator 1 remains the same, education program compliance, and that indicator has a total of 17 points. So when you reference the proposed changes in our current document from the website, you'll see that there are no changes in Indicator 1. Indicator 2, this may also help with the last policy question. Indicator 2 was formerly, if you see the slide, we've sort of struck out the former addition, and this is the proposed change. Indicator 2 under operations was formerly the financial oversight. And so that was Indicator 2. Our proposed change is to now title Indicator 2 Governance, Ethics, and Transparency. And what we will be evaluating is coming from the current Indicator 3. So we're basically, the governance portion of the operations section is being moved up to 2 because in large part, the former 2 is now going to be a part of financial oversight. There is one element from financial oversight that will remain an Indicator 2, and it is a part of governance, and that is the budget approval process, because that process is a part of transparent governance. And when your governing boards present the proposed budget and vote on the proposed budget, there are legal requirements on how that should be done. And so that will remain a part of governance. So the budget approval process that schools are familiar with your publicizing, having your public hearings, adopting the budget, that will stay in indicator 2 and be a part of governance, ethics, and transparency. And so the total point value for indicator 2 will be 20 points, and all of the measures that were once in indicator 3 for governance have just been moved up to 2. So that is indicator 2. Everything's being replaced with the indicator 3 language. And again, the budget approval in accordance with state law will remain. So I'm going to move now to indicator 3. So if we've moved governance from indicator 3, as you see, the former title for indicator 3 was governance and transparency. Indicator 3 will now be called obligations to students. All of the content is the same. It's moving from indicator 4. Formerly, indicator 4 measured students and employees. And within that measure, there were measures that dealt with students' rights and employee rights. So for students' rights, if you may be familiar through monitoring, we would look at your code of conduct. We would look at the FERPA laws, as well as services for students with disabilities, English language learners, all of the rights that belong to students. And then within that same indicator, we would also look at employee rights or employer obligations, meaning to your staff, federal anti-discrimination laws, your Family Medical Leave Act, the Fair Labor Standards, all of the legal obligations as it relates to employees. And all of those were together in one indicator, which was indicator for students and employees. So with the reorganization, we are separating out students. So indicator 3 now alone is obligation to students. It's the existing measures. So in the current CPF, this would be measures 4A to 4C, and it will just deal with students and obligations to students, and the total point value there is 18 points. Then for indicator 4 is going to be designated just to deal with employees, but it will be as an employer at the state charter school. As the employer, it's the employer's obligations. Like, as an employer, what are your legal obligations to your employees? That will be broken out separately now. So the former indicator 4 is now in 2 indicators. Indicator 3 for obligations to students, and indicator 4, employer obligations. So in employer obligations, the content of the existing measures 4D and 4E, they will remain the same. And the point value for indicator 4 will be 15 total points. Now, within indicator 4, we are adding a measure for C, and that measure will deal with employee civil rights. And the question is, does the school adhere to applicable requirements to ensure the protection of employee civil rights? In the actual CPF, you will see that that language for the proposed changes as it relates to employee civil rights for C will look at applicable laws and regulations. As previously stated, it'll be like the Title VII, the Family Medical Leave Act, the Fair Labor Standards Act, any nepotism and conflict of interest policies. So those are some of the governing policies related to employment, and that will be a part of 4C, employee civil rights. In indicator 5, which is school environment, there are no changes. So indicator 5, just as a brief overview, deals with the safety of the school environment, the facilities, health and safety, information, data and communications, safety plans, all applicable legal obligations as it relates to the school environment. There are no changes in that indicator, and the total point value is 18 points. And then the last indicator in the operations section is indicator 6. There are no changes in the title for indicator 6, which is continuing and legal obligations. There is updated language. There's updated language in both 5 and 6, and that updated language deals with the new policies. So in indicator 5, going back to indicator 5, there are policies relating to facilities and the SCSC facilities rule. So the language has been updated just to make sure that in looking at the school environment, the language is updated to include fire inspections, related records, viable certificate of occupancy, documentation of the requisite insurance coverage, approval from Godot regarding initial site selection and facility requirements, and any subsequent reports or approvals that are mandated by law, SCSE or Godot rules, regulations, and policies. So that is updated language as it relates to school environment and facilities. And then in indicator 6, which is the additional and continuing obligations, the new language that has been added deals with our new probation rule. And the language includes that if a school is on probation and has a corrective action plan, then part of their additional and continuing obligations would be that they have remedied the conditions which precipitated the probation. Those conditions no longer exist, and that no new conditions necessitate probationary status. So that language update is just keeping aligned to the 2 new rules that were adopted this year, our probation rule and our facilities rule. And so the point value for indicator 6 is 12 points. So there are, again, no new content, just the reorganization. The biggest change, just as a summary for the operations section, is the financial oversight, moving to the finance section of the CPF, and then separating out students' obligations to students being indicator 3, and employer obligations being indicator 4. And so with monitoring, be it site visit or desk monitoring for the policy, practice, and procedure review, the monitoring results would be the 1 data point. And then if you consult the appendix of your CPF, you will see the other data sources that are also taken into account for the overall operations CPF score, which do include cross-functional monitoring from Godot, as well as annual reporting, and any complaint investigations from complaints that the SCSE may receive, or from any federal or state agency. And so just as a note reminder that's already been stated, when the changes, the updates to the CPF become effective, this would be for 23-24. So the upcoming monitoring cycle, schools would be monitored based on these changes. But again, the CPF results that you receive in 23-24, those CPF results, your scores, are going to be for the school year that we're in, that just ended, 22-23. So you would not see your monitoring results as a data point in your CPF score until you receive the CPF scores for the 23-24 school year. And so the CPF scores always come out the year after the data. So the data is obtained in 1 year and then you receive your score the next year. And so I can pause now for any questions on the operation performance section.
Thank you, Tiffany. Right now, I don't have any questions for you. So as I noted before, audience, feel free to type in questions, or you can always submit things to us later or through the form online. So I will move on. We have just one more slide for you. So here's our timeline. So we originally shared this proposal at the SCSE board meeting last week, and all of the documents are posted on our website. So you can click on this link here when this webinar gets sent out, or you can just go to the SCSE website, go to the school performance page, and there's a separate page for the 2023 CPF proposed updates. It has that page has these slides, and it also has a 2022-2023 CPF document redlined with the academic updates that were proposed that would go into effect for the 2022-2023 school year. And then we also have a 2023-2024 version of the CPF posted on the website that includes all of these proposed updates, so you could see what that would look like with all of the updates, the academic, finance, and operations updates included, that encompasses everything we reviewed here today. So that document is online as well as the feedback form for you to submit any feedback. All of that is on our website. So we hosted this webinar today, and then as I mentioned previously, we hope to adopt the final proposal at the July 26th SCSE meeting, taking into consideration any comments or feedback we receive from stakeholders. And that is all. That is the end of the webinar. I still don't see any additional comments or questions in the question pane. So I will wait for just a moment to see if anything else arrives. And if nothing does, then we thank you all so much for your time, and we look forward to receiving more feedback and input on the proposed updates.